Welcome to Second Saturday Conversation. This is a place where we explore Christianity in and for the 21st century. And I want to welcome back all of those who traveled the way with us last year. It's great to have you return. And a welcome to all of those for whom this is a new venture. Welcome aboard. I look forward to this sort of unfolding, what Kenneth Burke calls an unending conversation about our lives together. I'm glad we're here, and I don't think that it's insignificant that we have come together. We're all haunted by Christianity in one way or another. And I even suggest that we're called to come together to talk about how it haunts us or calls us. So it's great that we're here together. The overarching title for this year's conversation is Telling the Story Again, Anew. Telling the story again, anew. And I'll say a little bit more about that as the morning goes on. But now I want to turn it over to Megan. Megan McCluskey is the person who makes all this Zoom stuff possible. And she'll let you know a little bit about mics and then how to prepare for plenary time. So Megan, do you want to sort of orient us a little bit before we continue?
Yes. Hi, sorry. I also had to unmute myself. Have to get back into the swing of things like everybody else too.
Yep. Megan was saying to me earlier today, she said, this is like going back to school. And I said, I'm not sure I have all my pencils sharpened, but here we are, off we go. So Megan.
Yes. Okay, so let me just admit one more person here. I have it all written so I don't forget anything, just as everybody knows. So good morning. I have the slightly unsavory portion of the morning, which last year I did get corrected. It is very important, but also unsavory at times. Just as a reminder to please keep yourselves muted throughout the morning unless we call upon you. If you do have a question or comment during the conversation, please direct them to the chat, which you should be able to find at the bottom of your screen. We want to use the chat space as a place for your comments related to the topic for the day, and we will draw from that chat space for our plenary session later this morning. If you want to be called upon, you can also indicate that in the chat. Before the plenary, we will give you a few minutes to write in the chat. During this plenary session, at the end of the presentation, with Jeff Cresswell as our moderator, this will be a time to reflect on the thoughts and ideas shared by Marianne. If you would like to personally connect with Marianne, we are offering a coffee time from 11 to 11:15 after the presentation and plenary. Again, if you have any questions during the conversation,
on this.
Hang on one second. I'm going to mute you. Again, if you have any questions during the conversation, please direct them to the chat. Please keep yourself muted unless called upon by myself, or Jeff Cresswell.
And then I was.
No, it says mute, so do it.
Here, I can mute you real quick too. Got it? Okay, perfect. At which, once Jeff and I call upon you, you can unmute yourself. Everybody should be muted when they come in, so you shouldn't have to push any buttons, but otherwise, I've got your back. And then thank you so much for your time and space this morning, and enjoy. Oop, I may have muted Marianne.
Unmute.
There we go.
There we go.
I got a little mute happy, I think.
Yes, well, and who knows, you might unmute me as I'm talking and it's like, I'm not sure. Anyway, mute. Fortunately, Megan's the only one who can do that. Isn't that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. To start out this morning, I want to say a little bit about the music that led us into our time together. Now, I know that a number of you will not have heard the music. It starts at 9:15, it goes until 9:30, and that's fine. And those of you who will be hearing this as a recording will also not hear all of the music. But the music that I picked for today is intentional. And so I want to say a little bit about the music that I chose. Last year, for those who were in part of the conversation, I played Van Morrison's When Heart is Open. Mark and I courted to Van Morrison. So Van Morrison has a special place in my heart. And I love that song, When Heart is Open, you will change, just like a flower slowly opening. So that was our lead in for last year's conversation. This year, it's a little bit different. The first minute and 40 seconds that you heard is actually music from the television series Detective Montalbano, which is shown on MHZ, which is like a international Netflix. And Salvo Montalbano is a detective in Sicily, and it's a great series. And the music that I played is the introductory music for the series about Detective Montalbano. Detective Montalbano, that I loved that series, and it was a couple of years after Mark died, and that program, I mean, I kind of gave myself an episode of that every night, and it helped me through. So, and the music's a little quirky. I love it. So when I hear that music, I have really great associations with it. And as I said, for the series, it was the introduction where the titles were shown. So that's the first piece of music you heard. The second music is the wonderful music by George Gershwin and lyrics by Ira Gershwin. It Ain't Necessarily So. And it's a rendition by violinist Nadia Salerno-Sonnenberg. I love what she does with this piece of music. And for most of us, I think, we are familiar with the lyrics to that song. It ain't necessarily so. It ain't necessarily so. The things that you're liable to hear in the Bible, it ain't necessarily so. Well, I think that's really appropriate for how we are reflecting on the tradition. And I think that it's all part of telling the story again, anew. The next piece that you heard was Second Time Around. And it was sung by Frank Sinatra with the wonderful orchestration by Nelson Riddle. Okay, so love is lovelier the second time around. Okay, with both feet on the ground. Who can say what brought us to this miracle we found? Some say that love comes but once, and yet a second time around. I also think that speaks to, Marcus talks about meeting Jesus again, reading the Bible again, seeing Christianity again. I suggest that we can fall in love even with this tradition again. There's a second time around. The final two songs are both compositions by Alexis French, who is a composer and very popular in the UK right now. The fourth song that we heard is called Bluebird. And French says that this actually was an improvisation. He didn't plan it, it emerged. And that also is very consistent with, I think, some of the themes that we're going to be dealing with this year, that what is to come is not always planned. It's not planned. And Bluebird, this improvisational work of his, is a response to the bluebird, whose symbol is about hope and renewal and peace and a harbinger of happiness. And the bluebird can also signify the beginning of a new phase. And then the final song that we heard, also by Alexis French, is entitled Dreamland. And French said that he composed this to provide a place of comfort and a place to rebalance and a place to renew in these troubled times. Okay. And he hopes that Dreamland will inspire change. Oops. Will inspire change. This is hello, darling. No, sweetie pie. That is Theo. I must now make a comment. By the way, that's the first time he's ever jumped up in a chair that I'm sitting in. Hi, sweetie. My beloved Abby, whom some of you know, died in February of this last year, February 2nd. And she actually had a good death, but I won't go into that right now. It's a bit of a fluke how Theo came into my world, but by the end of March, I had another dog at 14 weeks, and he's now about 9 months. And I mentioned to you in one of the sessions last year that if I ever got another dog, I'd name it Theopoetics or Hermeneutics. Well, I decided to name him Theopoetics. So for short, he's Theo. So that burst of unplanned inspiration that dropped into my lap is Theo. So that was the fifth song that you heard, Dreamland by Alexis French. And when I hear the title Dreamland, I can't help but think of the speech of Martin Luther King's that was given on the 28th of August in 1963. And Martin Luther King Jr. was speaking to about 250,000 people from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. And by the way, it's told that the night before, on August 27th, he didn't know what he was going to say. He wasn't sure yet. Okay. So on the August 28th, he's speaking to this crowd, and he's about maybe 2/3 into his speech, and a voice comes out from the crowd. It's a friend of his. It's Mahalia Jackson. And she cries out and says, Martin, tell them about the dream. Tell them about the dream. And the speech undergoes a little bit of a pivot, a little bit of a shift. And Martin Luther King Jr. starts talking about, I have a dream that one day, I have a dream that one day, I have a dream. So our musical prologue leads us into our topic for the year, telling the story again, anew. And we might as well have a subtitle. Tell me about the dream. I want to recap a little bit from last year. I began last year's second Saturday session by saying, no. I told you some things I don't believe in. I mentioned that I don't believe in the God of supernatural theism. I don't believe in a God who's kind of a Superman, an Ubermensch, who is victorious and mighty and has a plan and is going to save us. And he will deliver us with a mighty hand. And it just happens to be our God. I don't believe in the God of supernatural theism. I don't believe in the virgin birth. No, no, no. I don't believe in original sin. I actually don't think it's biblical. I think it's a later development, and I don't believe in it. I don't believe in that Jesus is is the sacrifice for us, that Jesus is our substitutionary atonement that makes up for the distance between us and God, and that killing God's only beloved son was the best that God could come up with for bridging the gap. I don't believe in substitutionary atonement. And I don't believe that the Bible is the words of God, the epistema verba, that this is God directly speaking to us, and it's been dictation. The Bible is not infallible. The Bible is not the words of God. Someone commented that in this list of no, that I didn't mention resurrection. Well, there's a reason for that. So last year, I started out with no. This year, I'm starting out with yes. Last year and this year as well, we will build on the work of Marcus Borg, and Marcus provides lenses, corrective lenses, I might say, to help us see Christianity again and reflect on our understanding of the tradition. Last year, we also started to incorporate the understanding and wisdom of Jacques Caputo. And Jack kind of takes the lenses of Marcus Borg and puts them in a kaleidoscope. And Jack's work, and Mark's, but brought us to an exploration of radical theology. Okay, radical theology, which is a response to classical theology, which is more propositional and confessional. So some things about radical theology that invite us to think about. One is the weakness of God. The weakness of God. Things like justice and love and hospitality and forgiveness and compassion that don't come by coercion, that rather than God being sovereign and militant and overpowering and decisive, it may be a way to talk about God in contrast to what the world thinks is strong, that God actually comes to us in a kind of weakness. Don't underestimate that weakness. Radical theology also asks us to consider and always be mindful of hermeneutics. It's a nice fancy name. Hermeneutics, which was one of the options for naming my dog, in which case he would be Herman. Hermeneutics, which is the art of interpretation. Okay. Hermeneutics claims that, we come into the world which is up and running. So we inherit, if you will, interpretations for what's going on and how we got here, okay, which is all right. But those are indeed inherited interpretations. The art of hermeneutics says we really need to be responsible for our interpretations. And hermeneutics said everything is an interpretation, but we need to continue to interpret, reinterpret, recontextualize. Okay. And that hermeneutics is an ongoing thing. Theopoetics is something else that comes out of radical theology. And as I said, my beloved new dog is named Theopoetics. Short is Theo. Theopoetics is a language style that knows that it cannot contain what it cannot contain. So there's a trembling in the language of theopoetics. Theopoetics suggests that there is more than what the language can reflect. Something is happening in the language of theopoetics, but it's not a kind of definitive dogmatic language like so much of theological language is. Okay. So radical theology suggests that theopoetics is actually more appropriate in our effort to talk about our experience of God. Then there is event, which we will talk much more about this year, but event is another name for God. And then there's the impossible, which is related to event. And we'll also say more about that this year. So, and let me suggest about the impossible, that the impossible that we're talking about is an impossible that says that the impossible is not impossible. So last year, we meandered through an exploration of radical theology. And I say meandered because somebody actually sent me a text and described it that way. And that is a bit of my style. So last year, we meandered through radical theology. Radical theology, as I said a moment ago, is a response to classical theology, which tends to be more confessional, propositional, doctrinal. At the heart of radical theology is deconstruction. That's what I'm going to be beginning to introduce today. Okay. Deconstruction is at the heart of radical theology. And let me tell you where I come out on all of this before even we get started. I suggest, my understanding comes from Jacques Caputo. I'll say something about that in a moment. So this is a distillation of what I'm beginning to understand reading Jacques Caputo. But deconstruction is a faith. And the faith of deconstruction is the dream that calls us to what is to come. That one day, deconstruction is driven by a passion and a desire and a love for what eye has not seen nor ear has heard. Another way of saying that is that deconstruction is driven by the love for God. So last year I started with no. This year I begin with yes to what is to come. And that yes is faith. And the dream to come that no story can fully contain. Deconstruction. It's an approach to textual criticism. And it was developed by Jacques Derrida. A book of his published in 1967 talks sort of when he presents all of this stuff about deconstruction. So it's fairly new. So Jacques Derrida is the father of, if you will, deconstruction, an approach, a philosophical approach to textual criticism. Now, I knew nothing about deconstruction. I actually had no interest in deconstruction. I'd heard about it sort of on the periphery, but it didn't catch my eye until I read Jacques Caputo. Now, I cannot fathom Jacques Derrida. Okay. Jacques Caputo does. Jacques Caputo understands Derrida in a way that it just, it really opened up things for thinking for me. And I've even said to Jack that I think he does Jacques Derrida better than Derrida. So I was introduced to deconstruction through Jacques Caputo, who incidentally, I want you to know, is going to be our guest next month. October 9 is our second Saturday next month, and Jack will be our guest. I'll say more about that at the end. Because I'm not a scholar, I'm a pastor. I have taken some of the insights and wisdom and approach of deconstruction, not only as it helps me with text and even unpacking and reflecting on Christianity, but also I think it can be applied to reflecting and even analyzing our lives. Okay. So I think that deconstruction is a gift to text, to Christianity, and even to our lives. So deconstruction. The definition for it in brief is deconstruction, breaking down. But it is not demolition. Deconstruction is not some secular notion, a destructive notion like smash the state. Deconstruction is rather a faith, a response to a challenge to what is to come. It's a response to a calling to what is to come that we know not what. Deconstruction, even though it means breaking down, I think it's more helpful to say it's breaking open. And deconstruction continues to break open a text or an understanding or our lives. Okay. Some observations of deconstruction. Deconstruction says there are no fixed meanings. There are no fixed meanings. That's not going to go down well with a lot of people. He suggests, or deconstruction suggests, that meaning is created, not given. Meaning is created. Okay. And I think that's related to hermeneutics, interpretation, and theopoetics, that something's going on in the language of theopoetics and something emerges from it, an experience, if you will. Okay. So deconstruction says, there are no fixed meanings. Therefore, deconstruction calls us to raise our level of vigilance about what calls itself meaning or truth or tradition or even ethics. Okay. Calls us to be more vigilant about what calls itself meaning. And deconstruction plays, and indeed it does, it plays with possible meanings. And what a different take might yield. That's part of the play of deconstruction. And deconstruction, and again, this is related to hermeneutics, says that translating or translation is unending. That we're always translating, we're always recontextualizing, we're always interpreting, okay? Now, these things can sound like trouble to a faith or an institution that's frozen in certitude or that's ossified into a certain way of being and thinking that is immobile, that becomes immobile. This can be troubling to a faith or an institution that bases its claims on dogma and doctrine and a certain declaration of what is. Okay? But the gift of deconstruction is that it can give old texts new meaning, new readings. It can give old traditions new twists. It can give a life that's maybe all too familiar a freshness, another start, a new beginning. So deconstruction does not let traditional discourse close in on itself or shut down on itself. That kind of complacency and just acceptance, well, it's always been this way, it refuses that. So deconstruction is really driven by a deeper affirmation or desire beyond itself. Okay. It's a passionate outstretching for something other, something else, something not the same, something to come. It's a movement toward a future, but a future that's not planned, not programmed, not theologically or anthropologically ordered, which means really that everything is our doing. Deconstruction is driven by a desire, by a longing for what is to come, that is yet to be known. So as I said at the beginning of talking about deconstruction, it's a form of faith. It's a searching for the dream. It's a response to something that calls. It's the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things unseen. Deconstruction is a hope in what is coming. It is a welcome, and it welcomes it. It welcomes that hope like a promise and says, yes, yes, come. Come. Yes, yes. So the exclamation I suggest of deconstruction is Amen, which doesn't mean the end or it is finished, but means yes. Yes. Amen to what is to come. Amen. Yes, yes. I have a dream that one day, I have a dream that one day, that I suggest is the song and the sigh of deconstruction. I now want to call on three friends of mine, Jeff Creswell, Carol Creswell, Grant Pope. And I'd like them to reflect with us a little bit about story. I think it's all about story. And deconstruction is story's vitality. Jeff and Carol are very involved in spiritual formation work, and they're very involved in story, storyline, the power of story to transform, to open up. Okay, so because of their own vocational call to story, I'd love to hear them respond a little bit to what I've kind of put out there, but more directly, for them to share some of their thoughts about story and its importance. And Brant Pope has been involved with theater his entire life. He directed the biggest program in the country in theater and dance at University of Texas, Austin. And so being a person of theater and an actor, he knows a lot about story and what is communicated, what is evoked, all of this. We all live by a story, whether we know it or not. And I say that we live and die by our stories. Okay. Some of us are given a story. Well, we all are. Okay. It's up and running when we come in. Right. But some of us are said, this is your story. This is who you are. And we live out that story and then maybe find somewhere along the way that, that story is not really true. So some of us find that we're living a story and then realize it's not true. It's not really my story. Some of us live into a story that we want to have be true. Some of us live a story that we'll never see fully realized. Okay. But I suggest that story is really at the heart of, as human beings, this is part of the human work of imagination and longing and is story. And I think my hunch is that everyone's autobiography is everyone's autobiography. That there are things we experience in human life and in the human condition that others recognize as well, as different as our lives might be. So I think that autobiography speaks to autobiography. So with this in mind, and knowing that this year we want to wonder about what telling the story, the Christian story, or what telling the story again, but anew. Not that we really know how it's going to be retold. I think that I've said to friends that I'm afraid that I might retell this Christian story in more poetic language, and maybe we'll dress it up a little bit with more contemporary garb or change the gender things a little bit. I'm not sure that that's what telling the story again anew is going to lead us to. My hunch is that something is going to emerge from the story that we actually don't see right now. So telling the story again anew is an invitation to kind of an openness and exploration and a deep kind of listening and wondering. So I want Jeff and Carol and Brant to take, I don't know, 10 minutes or so, maybe we'll see how it unfolds. And then we'll move into plenary, because I'd love to hear what you are thinking about and what's been provoked by my comments and by Carol's and Jeff's and then Brant's. So do you want to take a deep breath? And then Carol, I'd love to hear your thoughts about story, and Jeff as well, and Brant. Where is Brant Pope? Is he here somewhere? Can you find him? We can pull him up. Pull him up later. That's not quite. We'll have him on the screen later. So Carol and Jeff, offer us some thoughts and reflections about your experience of story and how it functions in our lives and calls to us and what we might think about.
Thanks, Marianne.
Yeah.
It's really, it's been eye-opening and mind-expanding for me to think about deconstruction in the way that you are framing it. And I find that really hopeful.
I do too.
And
yeah, it's not smash the state.
it's not smash the state at all. No. I think that, my work with story, I've really come to understand that story it's our universal language. Mm-hmm. It's a language that is not dependent on a particular language such as English or Spanish or an African language or any native language. It's a language that we all understand because we're human. And I think the key for me, what sticks out for me in terms of deconstruction is that institutions such as the church have given us a particular story. And that story is held under the banner of belief. So the church tells a story and says, you know, if you're going to be a part of us, this is what you have to believe about this story. And what that denies is experience, my personal experience. So I'm given a choice. I either choose to believe that story, whether it conflicts with my experience or not, or I somehow assent to that story, but live my experience in sort of underground. And or I believe that story and I begin the process of distrusting my experience. Because if I want to be a part of this institution, this group, this community, I have to believe that story, and therefore I have to deny my own experience. And for me, the way I am understanding deconstruction, the way that you're speaking of it, is that it offers me the opportunity to wed my story to the story and to trust it, to begin to trust my story, and to understand that in trusting my story, I'm not denying anyone else's story. In fact, I'm able to open up and join other people's stories. So I think I appreciate the idea that meaning isn't fixed, because we construct meaning all the time, given the context and the situation that we find ourselves in. And yet I also understand that the institution depends on the stability of the story with a capital T.
Right.
And somehow
is the institution's job.
It's the institution's job. And yet institutions that become frozen in their stories end up dying. So somehow institutions have to learn how to open in the same way that we have to learn how to open to our own stories, and the institution has to open to change. And so I find deconstruction to be a story of yes. It's a story of hope. It's a story of there is a possibility that the dream becomes a reality. Because if you have a dream, it's something out there that you hope for.
Right.
Deconstruction allows me to say it could be, and I can do something to bring me closer to that dream. I can do something to bring us closer to that dream. That's kind of what's come up for me as I've heard what you've shared with us this morning.
And as I said in the beginning of this, that deconstruction is the heart of radical theology. It's at the heart of radical theology. So it's all about the impossible.
Yeah.
It may not be impossible. Anyway, thank you, Jeff. Carol, I'd love to hear some of your thoughts from your own experience with story and working with story in other countries and with children and adults and all that. But however you'd like to, whatever you'd like to share.
Thanks, Marianne. I spent most of my adult life working with story, particularly biblical story, and how to tell it as story, and how to create a space for children and adults to hear it and enter it as their story, which I think is the universal benefit of story, is that it really is how we make meaning and how we understand life and how we understand God and ourselves. As a human race, we all need story. It is so a part of who we are. And we have always told stories and listened to stories and used those stories to find our story and to find meaning, which I think is the task of all good religion, is to give us a language to make meaning, to understand ourselves, the world that we live in. 80% of the Bible is narrative, it's story. And yet I think we've gone so far away from hearing it and telling it as story. As Jeff said, it's often told as dogma or belief or rules. And the gift, I think, that we are being invited to in this work is to relearn how to live it, how to tell the story and how to hear the story. Someone I know who worked in a children's hospital, who worked with suicidal children, which is, you put those two words together, suicide and children, it's just very disturbing. But he said that he discovered that almost universally those children had no stories. They didn't know who their parents were. They didn't know where they came from. They didn't know where they belonged.
Wow.
And their healing was to bring anyone in who had any connection at all and tell them stories. Didn't matter whether they were good or bad stories, but it was like, this is who I am. This is where I came from. This is who I belong to. I have 5 children, and every year on their birthday, or at least most often, I try to tell them their birth story. And of course, it's changed over the years, which is part of the gift of story. We tell the story that we need to tell. And one of my favorite lines, especially in relation to biblical stories, is all stories are true, and some actually happened. And it doesn't matter when I start telling that story, even though they've heard it a million, well, at least 30 or 40 times now. But they get a little glimmer in their eyes and a smile, and it's like, this is who I am. This is where I came from. This is where I belong. And I think deconstruction is taking us away from looking at story as sort of the set in stone, and allowing us again to revisit again for the first time and see it with new eyes and fresh meaning. I know in my own experience, I grew up and the story was given to me. And I would say much of my religious journey has been about deconstructing, about saying, no, that's not who I am. No, that's not the way I've experienced God or that inner light. And through story, finding a way to hear my story and to make meaning out of it again. I think Friedrich Buechner says it so well, one of, I think, the most significant narrative theologians, when he says, maybe there's nothing more important than we keep track of our stories, of who we've met along the way and the things that we've happened, because it's precisely in those details that we most profoundly and intimately really know God. And he says, and who cares that it's my story or who my parents are? But he says, if I tell it anything right, it also is your story, and you will find your story in my story.
Wow.
Thank you, Marianne, for inviting us into this journey.
Oh, my goodness, you're so welcome. Carol and Jeff are really close friends of mine, and they also are good consultants on Second Saturday Conversation. So anything you want to piggyback or add to before I ask Brant what his thoughts are?
I'm ready to listen to Brant.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Brant Pope. Calling on Brant Pope. Is he there?
I haven't been able to find him in the list. So Brant, if you want to unmute yourself.
Brant, do you want to talk? Can you hear us? Are you there?
I glanced through the list, Marianne, and I didn't see his name, so he may have had something come up and isn't able to be with us.
Oh my, okay, yeah, he lives in New York State, and actually I was just in touch with him last night, so I'm hopefully all is well. I know that, as I mentioned, that Brant is involved in theater and acting, and that has everything to do with telling the story. With that in mind, knowing his theater background, Jeff, you have theater background too. Anything come up for you related to that, to theater and story?
Well, just I think that it's interesting if you think about theater that, you know, it goes back thousands of years as a way of embodying story.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Especially if we go back to the Greeks.
Mm-hmm.
And theater and religion were almost indistinguishable
Mm-hmm.
in the early days. And I think there's something important about that,
Yeah.
because it's about telling a story that we can all access in our own way, and yet at the same time it has a way of universalizing experience. When we experience something in the theater, all this whole community of people has experienced the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
We may take away different things, but we've all experienced the same story.
Yeah. I wonder if in some ways church functions or can function that way as well. We are all part of a way that story is told, the liturgy, and we may come away with different things, but I just wonder if there's a little bit of play in, as you were saying, the connection between theater and liturgy. Liturgy is designed schematically like a drama, you know, with an intro and a high point and a denouement and all of that. Anyway,
Wow.
yeah. Thank you, you two. And so let me now, let's move into plenary. And if Brant, if somehow you show up or whatever, just know from our conversation yesterday that I'd love to have you share some reflections from your own experiences. So I welcome us now to, in just a moment, we'll go into a plenary session to invite people to reflect on my thoughts about deconstruction. Thank you, Jack Caputo and Jacques Derrida. And what's stirring in you when you think about deconstruction, what might be stirring in you in terms of our journey with radical theology. What do you make of telling the story again anew? What do you make of story? Anyway, just whatever's coming up for you. I would just welcome hearing from you. So before we go into the plenary, I'm going to read for you listening guidelines, and I used these last year. I highly recommend them. I think they're really great. It's from Listening Hearts Ministries. You can get this online. We also have it on the website, but they are listening guidelines for our conversation here. So this kind of creates an ethos, hospitality for us as we speak and listen to one another. I think, Megan, you've got these on a slide. So when she puts them up, I'll read them to you. To take time to become settled in God's presence. Listen to others with your entire self, senses, feelings, intuition, imagination, rational faculties. Do not interrupt. Pause between speakers to absorb what's been said. Do not formulate what you want to say while someone else is speaking. Speak for yourself only. Express your own thoughts and feelings, referring to your own experiences, and avoid being hypothetical and steer away from broad generalizations. Do not challenge what others say. By the way, these are not easy to follow, but I think they're great. Listen to the group as a whole, to those who have not spoken aloud, as well as to those who have. Generally leave space for anyone who may want to speak a first time before speaking a second time yourself. And the final guideline, hold your desires and opinions, even your convictions, lightly. As I said, these are not easy to follow, or to abide by, but I encourage us to do our best to do so. And we will take the next 15, 20 minutes to do some reflecting together. I'm going to ring the bell and give us just a minute. After I rang the bell, at the end of a minute, I'll ring it again. And then I welcome people to share your thoughts about our being together today. Jeff, I know you are sort of double tasking, keeping track a little bit of what's been said in the chat and also sharing your own thoughts. I really appreciate you doing both. And Megan, you can help us out here too. For the plenary session, Jeff, why don't you be our MC here and call on people that have perhaps said something in the chat, and then maybe there's somebody who's going to want to speak that didn't put something in the chat. But Megan, you'll help us out with all of this?
Yeah.
I think you will.
Yes.
Okay.
I had to find my mute.
Yeah, there's a lot of good, rich discussion, comment that's coming up in the chat, and I'll see where we can begin. I think it'd be nice to hear from Kathleen Wakefield. Kathleen, you spoke about being a poet, and as you said, the words you used were an underground Christian.
I borrowed from you. I often feel like when I go to church, I'm sitting in the hinterlands of Christianity because I don't quite feel like I'm there with everybody. As a poet is always trying to find the language to contain what can't be contained in language. And so it goes back to what Marianne said, and it's an ongoing process. It's never satisfied. It's just a different way of storytelling, more condensed. And I think for me, some of the most satisfying things in the Bible are the poetry of the Bible, because it's so rich in all of the senses. We're allowed to participate with our whole selves, like Isaiah or the Psalms or whatever. without sort of direction in terms about what to believe precisely.
Mm.
I don't know. So, and music, I think, serves that same kind of function. So, you know, one of the questions I have is, how to create within a community that already exists some of what we're talking about in the sphere of worship.
Right.
It's very hard to do. I think can displease a lot of people. It's hard for some people to really take to this, or they're just not aware of. I think there's a lot of people who sit with some discomfort that haven't found a way of creating what we're talking about in the context of coming together as a community.
Right.
I don't know, that's probably enough said, but for me, poetry is probably a saving grace. It's how I work out a lot of these issues. I'm very interested in poetry that strives to do that.
Yeah, great. Yeah, Kathleen, thank you so much. And I think your question about how to create within a community that's already existing some of this, that's I think is a question that we will be addressing this year. So
wonderful.
And it's problematic.
Mm-hmm.
I think, you know, for so many of us, I was not raised in the church, but for many, they're so familiar with the language of the church liturgy that at this stage in life, our stage, that it's like, don't mess, don't mess, you know, and certainly, you know, when in the Episcopal Church, it's like, no, I want to know what's going to be said at my memorial service. You know, I know this language. I've danced with this language for, you know, my entire life. And so I want this, is, if you will, sung. And so, I mean, that's tender, that's intimate, that's important. So how to honor that, even as we may not interpret some of that in the same way. So, I mean, I think you've asked a really important question, and I think it's a subject that I'll be very interested to hear how we as a community here on Second Saturdays address it, and maybe what we come up with. So anyway, thank you for that. And I love your sense of poetry, of course, and a poem that I ended up with last year from Judith Wright called Grace. She said, and you talk about grace and poetry, her poem ends by saying, and sometimes I've seen it in a human face.
Mm-hmm. That's Judith Wright?
Yes, Judith Wright. She's an Australian poet, Judith Wright.
Okay.
So I dare say that poetry maybe is even seen in the human face. And thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'd like to call on Claudia Roberts, and also just to acknowledge the fact that with 200 people on the call, I'm not going to be able to get to everybody, but I'll certainly get to as many as I can. So is Claudia there?
Yes, I am. Thank you. I made a comment in chat that I like the image of deconstructing as it applies to deconstructing a house as opposed to demolishing it. Is that when I see that happening, I have a better feeling about who is implementing this job and what their values are and stuff. Because you deconstruct, then you have the opportunity to save things that are usable and maybe repurpose them rather than just bulldoze the full house. So that's an image that I can help apply to my faith, because I grew up in the church as a Methodist. And I know their theology quite well. But it's opening very wide these days. And that is a blessing, but it also makes it a challenge for you to really think about these things and open your heart to them and pray about them and come to second Saturdays. So, but that image is very helpful for me today. Thank you.
But you're welcome. And I love your emphasis on deconstruction, the emphasis on value. What's really of that, and even with a house, if you're going to redo it or whatever, what is of value? What's really worthy? And I think that those things about what's really worthy, or, if you will, what's worthy of the name of God, and then what do we value? I think those are two really important things that deconstruction invites us to wrestle with, like the angel wrestling
Yes,
with us.
we're all Jacob.
We are all Jacobs. Indeed. Yeah. Anyway, thank you.
Good.
Appreciate that.
Thank you, Claudia. Jennifer Maluski has her hand up. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that correctly.
So it's Molesky, but no one knows that. Thank you so much. I just wanted to say that for me, deconstruction is exciting because it invites us into inquiry and stay in the inquiry. I'm reminded of an old Buddhist story that I read once that's where someone is talking to Mara, who is the I may be mangling this, the embodiment of evil, and saying, it's like, doesn't it bother you when people discover some truth in the world? And Mara says, oh no, because they usually make it into a belief after that.
I think that's funny.
So I think there really is something about, it's like we want our points of stability, right? Our beliefs, we want to be done with the inquiry. And
Right.
yet to be in inquiry is to invite ourselves into dialogue with something else and into one another.
Yeah.
It is a way to invite ourselves not to be fixed,
Right.
to be open and malleable. I mean, there's nothing more malleable than to have your very reality be malleable. But yeah, and so I think, but it's very hard for us as human beings to stay in inquiry. And so to me, this is one of the gifts of deconstruction.
Yeah.
Is to stay in that question, to say, and I'll just close with one more thing. I once was very moved in a dialogue group between Muslim and non-Muslim women that I was in, where one of the Muslim women there, that's one of the great things about the prayers that we have. God is greater, that starts with. So it reminds me that everything we think of, anything we can possibly conceive of, God.
Whoops, you just froze.
And
Okay, just repeat what you said about
that
God is greater, but repeat that because you froze.
I said that's the trembling for me. That sense of that there's something about God that can't be contained in our language.
Right.
That can't be contained in our fabrics of meaning. So let's deconstruct, let's inquire.
Right.
With that sense of trembling that whatever it is we conceive of, God is greater even than that.
Yeah. Yes, it's Meister Eckhart's wonderful prayer, God, rid me of God. and that's in response to what you're saying, is that the God we can imagine and that we wonder and that we think we know is there. There's more, there's more to God than we think, that there's, and so that kind of constant inquiry, constant stretching out, that constant longing and yearning for that's part of the restlessness of our hearts, I think. And it's also, what I also love about what you're saying is that constant inquiry. I would suggest that's a constant movement to the future. And that has a hope in it, because it's like there's more possibilities. So it's a movement to a future that has, and what's implicit in that is that the future, it will have hope. The more we inquire about God, the more we'll discover.
Wow. I'm going to take that away from today's conversation.
Yeah. And that's,
Thank
I wonder if why it's not said that deconstruction is faith, not belief, okay, but of faith. And I think it's related to hope. So anyway, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Is Jim Mock still with us? Jim, you had a comment related to the Martin Luther King quote that Marianne used.
Yes, I grew up in the 60s, and I remember that amazing scene of hundreds of thousands of people that he was speaking to. No doubt there were many white extremists who either A, did not understand, or B, did not want that kind of a message. It would seem to me that many of the writers that we find in our Bible, if you will, wanted nonetheless to bring clarity, significant clarity and understanding within a culture that didn't have that understanding or clarity. So they weren't going to come out specifically to just say it out loud. His speech was beautiful. I've been in the church he preached from.
Yeah.
I was able to stand at the lectern where he preached from. My heart just started going rapid
I bet.
with a heartbeat. I got chills. The man was brilliant. With all his faults, he was brilliant. And I think many of the writers in our Bible were brilliant in attempting to go so much deeper into an understanding of the faith of that time, of that audience. How do we dance around that? How do we not say, we are struggling to try to find the actual understanding of the audience at that time. My experience is in broadcasting, communication.
Great.
I've done dance, I've done the TV commercials. I got out of commercial TV because I couldn't stand that kind of stuff. I was in public television. We always had in our mind, who's the audience? How do we want to touch that audience? Are we not speaking, or maybe at times, I don't want to be critical, dancing around that issue? My faith has grown significantly thanks to Marcus Borg. He has changed my life. And I'm in a progressive church, which has been freeing. My background and parents were literalists. So I'm struggling with the issues that we're discussing about constantly re-understanding. There needs to be a time when we do ultimately understand something better. Jill Levine in her books, as a Jewish scholar, as a person who teaches New Testament, and she's Jewish, gives such clarity. So I don't know, help me out here. I'm struggling with all these issues. They're kind of mixed up in a pot, but I don't think I want to. Yeah, that's the book, whoever held it up. I'm really struggling with this, and many others may as well. So I ask for your help. Thank you.
Yeah. I'm really intrigued with what you're saying with the struggling. I'd actually like to hear you say just a little bit more. I'm with you about clarity. That I think that was one of Marcus's gifts, that Marcus brought his scholarship and his actually good intuition and his historical discipline to Christianity. And he brought a clarity to understanding that it has. I'm so glad it's changed your life, it's changed my life, it's changed many people's lives. And it was the clarity, I think, the way he was able to articulate that created a real bridge for people to cross, to return to church or return to Christianity or whatever. So it was not just, it wasn't so fluid that there was nothing there to hold on to or stand upon. Okay.
Yes,
So
yeah.
I'm with you about the clarity piece. I also think that deconstruction is, I don't think it is, it's not opposed to clarity, but I think what deconstruction is calling us to be mindful of is that the matter might be settled for the moment, but I'm sure that people in physics and quantum physics and mechanical physics can help me out here, but
Yes. Oh,
nothing is static.
yeah.
Nothing is fixed, really. But I think because of something Carol said about our longing for stability, and it's like, Father, just tell me what to believe and I'll believe it, right? We want that kind of stability. We want clarity. And I think deconstruction is saying, just be vigilant about the clarity. And if it's helping you to be clear, great. But remember, things are always changing. Things are always moving. Things are always, I might say transforming. And I agree to live in the tension of wanting clarity so that we can make some decisions and act and do something, and then also the awareness that, you know what, we don't know. We don't know. That's part of the human dilemma. And I think that's part of our task. How do we live in that tension? And a lot of us don't have the tolerance for it.
Yeah.
My hunch is that even though you said, I'm really, really struggling, my sense is that you have the tolerance for it.
Yes, I do. Up to a point, I guess. I mean, I think of those who are trying to understand history, archaeologists and whatever, and that knowledge base builds over time to where ultimately, in many cases, they say, well, this has totally changed our viewpoint.
Right.
Yes, another 100 years, 1,000 years, it could change again.
Right.
But in the communication business that I was in, I had to know my audience. I had to know how to touch them in some way, a new way, an old way, whatever it was, because if I couldn't do that, I failed.
Mm-hmm.
And if Jesus, if the interpretations of what Jesus said, both as remembered history and whatnot, there was still a goal, a specific goal, just like there was for Martin Luther King, to touch us in a certain specific way. And
Right.
don't search for that.
Right. And I think that touching one another is, I think we can do that in all kinds of ways. And I wouldn't put that in the goal category. Okay.
Yeah.
But I think Martin Luther King, when he said, I have a dream.
Yeah.
One day. I mean, I can say that right now, and it resonates all kinds of things for me in terms of my own hope and stuff. Okay. So this is, in some ways, I think when you talk about the audience, I know there's some technical thing, who's your audience and getting to your audience and marketing and, the message for the audience. I get that. But on another level, the audience is us. It's the human spirit.
True.
It's the human spirit. And I think there's so much about defining the market that actually ends up clouding the longing of the human spirit that wants to be addressed. It's like, address me.
Yes, that can happen.
And I think at its best, that's what theology will do, is
Yeah.
address you.
Thank you so much. I so appreciate these gatherings. Thank
Yeah,
you.
good. Well, yeah, and I took my time to just sort of talk with you, but you've stirred a lot of thinking for me. So thank you.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Okay.
Appreciate it.
Sorry, Jeff, kind of went on.
No, that's what this is all about.
Okay.
That's appropriate. Jeanette, you had your hand up.
Yes, this Jeanette here? Okay.
That's the one.
Oh, this conversation, so much of it is setting off bells in my head.
Jeanette,
And just
hello, Jeanette. Hi. Nice to see you.
and you as well. Just recently, just a week ago or so, I was having a conversation with a friend about sitting in church and when the story is told and how we react if it doesn't resonate with us. And there are a variety of ways to deal with that situation. And so I'll just read so that I'm concise. I will just read what I wrote in response to when that came up in the conversation today. And that is that my personal faith is born and lives and grows in that place where my experience of the story being told in church comes alive. And this is what I consider the growing spot of my personal relationship with God. I think when the story is told in a way, I've always gone to church and in my head had a little bit of a conversion story going on, or an explanation to myself about what in my heart and my soul and my spirit is resonating with the story that's being told. And it might be in different words than are being projected in church. And I value that rather than discount the way the story is being told. I want to create an awareness that that story can be literally true for some, and that's okay.
Right.
But if it isn't, I'm not an outcast. I'm just experiencing my personal relationship with a living, growing God that is living and growing with me in that moment. So that's all I had to say.
Yes. Yeah, thank you, Jeanette. My hunch is that a number of people can really respond to that and recognize that. And I think one of the things about the stories in church, and this is where it gets tricky, is that we hear the stories and then we hear the interpretations. And we might hear the story in a different way than how it's being interpreted. And so if I'm hearing you rightly, it's like, however that story is speaking to you and unfolding, and it's curious about you, just as you're curious about the story, that's its own work. And I think it has integrity. It's like what Jeff was saying earlier today about, we tend to not trust our feelings or trust our whatever, feelings or interpretations are sometimes suspect, as though there's a certain criteria that is, this is getting into the truth question, which is a really dicey one. But this is where deconstruction will say, just be vigilant about what claims meaning and truth.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, just be vigilant about it, So what I love about what you're saying is, and this is true for me too, that in church, these stories still speak to me. They still call to me because of the nature of the stories. And indeed, they're stories. If we start thinking about them in terms of historicity or belief, criteria, propositions for belief, then I think we miss it.
Mhm.
But anyway, this is does that mirror at all kind of what you're getting at?
Definitely. Thank you, Marianne. Yes.
Yeah, well, you got me thinking about this. And so here's to the story. Let's keep telling the stories. Okay. Anyway, thanks, Jeanette. Really nice to see you. Hope all is well in Tualatin. Okay.
Thank you, Jeanette. Edgar Wales had a comment about God as relationship.
Yeah.
Edgar?
Unmute. Are you muted?
You're still muted. There,
Really?
There you go.
there we go.
Okay, I think I have a bad connection on my headset. So, oh, help when I put the microphone down by my mouth.
There you go.
Sorry about that. Yeah, so my comment in the chat was, I see God more as relationship than an event. I think events are difficult to deconstruct. They happen and they are what they are. And whereas relationships, you know, they can be changed, they can be repaired, they can be strengthened. And so for me, I see God as relationship. And I think it's consistent with what we're learning about, you know, the universe. Everything is in relationship with each other. So when we, you know, get down to the elemental level and we think about all those relationships that exist within our bodies, and then I also think about what St. Paul said, and I paraphrase, you know, God is whom lives and moves, and I don't know how he said it.
Yeah.
Lives and
Actually,
moves.
that's St. Luke. That's St. Luke. The God is the one in whom we live and move and have our being.
Yeah, that's the one.
That's
So
Luke.
to me, that not only ties in the science, but it also ties in our religious tradition through scriptures. So I see a really strong attraction to viewing God as a relationship rather than event.
Okay.
I think I'll stop there because I'm sure other people want to talk.
Yeah. Thank you, Edgar. And let me just make a little note about event. We'll talk more about event. It's actually a technical term. Okay. So the way you described event, in contrast to relationship, I understand, but I think event is holds more mystery than might be suggested by the first take on the name. So event we'll explore more. And my personality type, it's relational and personal and all of that stuff. I think that we are in relationship with God and certainly with one another and all that is. I mean, I love that quote from in Luke Acts, that God is the one in whom we live and move and have our being. I just think, oh my gosh, we can unpack that forever. But don't over anthropomorphize the relationship, because that kind of leads us back to this God of supernatural theism. So yes, we can't help but be relational. It can't help but be personal. And I think that whatever it is that we live and move and have our being in is definitely relational, and it's personal, and it's something other than anthropomorphic. And so how do we get our heads around that, you know? Good morning. But it's something more than that. And and you're talking about attractions. I'm struck by the image of strange attractors, which I think is also in physics. We're all in this, we're all in relationship. I agree with you. And if we really get that, it'll change the way we live with one another. If we really get that. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you, Edgar.
Thank you, Edgar. Thanks. And maybe time for one more, and then I'll move into a close, because we're just about at closing time.
Yeah, one more. I just noticed that Rebecca's hand is up. Rebecca?
Yes, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Oh, good. I am being deconstructed.
Yeah. Well, hallelujah.
Existentially, socially, everything.
Okay. Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. Go ahead.
That's hard not to be afraid.
I know.
And for some reason, Stanley, is his name Stanley Howers? I don't ever.
Hauerwas?
Howers, he came to St. Paul's in Houston. I've only heard him speak once.
Okay.
And I don't remember anything he said except that he stood there and chuckled and he said, people think they want to get close to God, but being close to God is like standing next to a white hot fire. And that struck me because it just completely takes away the sentimentality of what the church should be about. And of course, I'm thinking of Niebuhr as being the social pioneers. And I'm going, so I'm deconstructed. I'm not able to see that happening. I am not being that as much as I would desire to. I don't even know what that looks like. And so it's very, and my dad was a minister, Methodist minister, Yale Divinity School. Niebuhr was his teacher, Richard. And Reinhold, my mother can tell stories about him flashing across the, and so I am so like my father gave his life to the church, his soul to God, and yet I can't seem to. And so in that decomposition, or what was deconstruction, whatever, I haven't been able to engage in the story because I don't have a way to do it. And that's kind of this, I was a groupie, Marcus Boyd show up, I would be there. Dominic Crossan, I would be there. Chittister, Amy Gillibine. I mean, you go on, you do get on fire when you hear this. And then to make it real on the ground level of your life. Right. I mean, it's just, I'm at a loss.
Well, you're not totally lost. Not totally. Here we are. Oh, we're all lost together. There we go. I think what you're saying is really important. And if the church tends to sentimentalize or domesticate or make Jesus our friend and God our friend too, in a kind of a nice way, I think it betrays the prophetic tradition that's really where Christianity came from and that Jesus was steeped in. And Stanley Howard Voss is more on the prophetic tradition of justice and the importance of change and the fact that there are no guarantees how it's going to turn out. I mean, this is the hard part, okay? It's like, actually, there are no guarantees, which is why the faith and hope of deconstruction is so powerful, because it knows there are no guarantees. And even so, I have a dream that one day, and as long as we keep hoping for that, I think that's the fire that will not consume. But I think that our despair is a fire that will consume us. So how to live in that tension? Again, we're living in the tension of knowing that no, God is not going to save us with a mighty hand. But I also dare say we will not be sent away empty. Or maybe empty is how we will be sent away. We can play with all that language. But so I love what's going on with you, which is sort of a move from when I was a child, I thought like a child. But now, we're seeing through a glass darkly. And yet we still long for the face-to-face. That's part of all of this. So my word to you is do not give up hope. It's all changing, I know. We can't grasp it. But I'm of the belief and faith that there is something that we live and move and have our being in something that actually calls to us. And we're here together on Second Saturday saying, do you hear what I hear? Okay. Let not your heart be troubled, neither let it be afraid. Okay.
Thank you.
And the scriptures say you cannot see the face of God and live. I know, it causes me to tremble too. So fear and trembling. Thank you, Kierkegaard. Fear and trembling. Fear and trembling. Here we are together in fear and trembling.
So Mary Ann, I think we'll let you move on to the close. We had a lot of other comments, but those will be retained in the chat.
Perfect.
Megan has put a comment in the chat that people should feel free to email those questions if they'd like to the foundation. So
perfect. A quick close, and then we will have coffee time without the coffee, but we'll have coffee time in about 5 minutes. Okay, so as a close, and my apologies, we're after 11 o'clock. I want to honor our time for everyone's sake. So my apologies for today. Let me just acknowledge that today is 9/11, and it's been 20 years since the events of 9/11. And some people say that everything has changed. Actually, I don't think everything has changed. Too many things are the same. We're still fearful and distrustful and vengeful and violent. And there's a lot of remarkable things that have happened in the last 20 years as well. And a lot of things that are yet to come, I'm sure. So I want to just give a moment of silence for us to be mindful of the events of 9/11 and all of its darkness and light. And let me say to all of us, we are a people who must never give up hope. Never give up. The Dalai Lama said that too, never give up. So be mindful, as we all are, but today is 9/11 and it's been 20 years. On our next session, October 9th, that's the second Saturday of October, Jack Caputo will be our guest. October 9th is also the death date of Jacques Derrida. So I asked Jack if he would be willing to be with us on that death date and share with us his understanding and experience of Jacques Derrida and why Derrida has been so important to him. I think Mark Borg freed a lot of us. I think Derrida freed Jack, but that's my interpretation. He'll tell you the real story. And I think that Derrida and deconstruction can actually help free us. So next time, October 9, Jack Caputo, and I'll do this sort of interview style with him. And finally, I want to acknowledge my beloved friend and colleague, Bill Ellis, who died unexpectedly on April 25th in 2020. Bill and I started Second Saturdays together in Bend, Oregon, in real time, real people, in real live space. And we decided that we wanted to have a conversation about Christianity in and for the 21st century and thought, well, let's just give this a try. So we got together and I think it was 2018 and started conversation, and people kept showing up. We kept the unending conversation. And, Bill was my colleague and friend, and we were actually kind of like ice skaters, and some people thought we were on thin ice sometimes. And sometimes we didn't really land our triple Lutz, but we had a rollicking good time and I loved it. And Bill Ellis kind of helped me to come alive again in conversation about theology and church and stuff. So I have deep regard for Bill Ellis, and his death was a complete shock, completely unexpected. I was in email communication with him just the night before he died. So I want to honor Bill Ellis. If it were not for Bill Ellis, I would not be continuing this conversation with you in this way. He would have wanted me to. So Bill Ellis was brilliant. He was funny, a wonderful theologian, a wonderful, wonderful human being. He has 2 beautiful daughters and a beautiful wife, and he's dearly, dearly missed. Bill said that at his funeral, and who thinks we're ever really going to die, but Bill said, at my funeral, I want Ripple, a song by the Grateful Dead, to be played. He was a deadhead, by the way. He was anything but a deadhead. He was remarkable, intellectual, vibrant thinker. But he was a deadhead, and he wanted Ripple to be played. So as we go out today, the next 3-4 minutes, you'll be hearing the Grateful Dead's Ripple. And that's in honor of Bill Ellis. And the chorus for Ripple is, ripple in still water, when there's no pebble tossed, nor wind to blow. That sounds like the promise of deconstruction to me. There's a ripple in still water when there's no pebble tossed and nor wind to blow. So Bill, like Marcus, like Jack Caputo, like Jacques Derrida, like Martin Luther King Jr., have all made ripples. And as John Lewis said, let us make trouble, good trouble, necessary trouble. And as he said, don't be afraid to make a little noise. So here's to Bill Ellis, to Ripple, to being in good trouble, necessary trouble. Thanks for being with me today. I'll look forward to seeing you next month.